You're about to hear a story that begins with trust, then slowly unravels. When we talk about family, we expect loyalty. We expect support. But sometimes the greatest betrayal comes from the ones closest to us. Tonight's story is about a promise made with a handshake and money meant to build a future. But what happens when that promise is broken? Stay with me, and let me take you through the journey of hope, regret, and lessons learned. This is My Brother Borrowed Wedding Money and Never Paid Back. You always imagined that your wedding would be simple but meaningful, something that reflected the years of effort you had quietly put into building your life. For months, really, if you were honest, for years, you had been saving with discipline. Every extra shift at work, every dinner cooked at home instead of ordered out, every indulgence you turned down, it all added up. When you opened your bank app and saw the balance reserved for your wedding, there was a quiet pride in your chest. This was not just money. It was the visible proof of patience, planning, and responsibility. Family and friends teased you sometimes for being so careful. Why not just use a credit card? Why not borrow a little? They'd ask. But you knew better. Debt weighed on people like an invisible stone, and you didn't want that stone dragging at your ankles when you were supposed to be celebrating one of the happiest days of your life. So you put the money aside little by little until, finally, it was there. Enough for a ceremony. Enough for a reception. Enough to feel like you were stepping into marriage on a foundation of stability. The fund was supposed to be safe. You had it in a separate account. You never touched it, and you spoke about it only rarely. But money, even when kept quiet, has a way of whispering through a family. Your younger brother had always been the opposite of you. Where you tightened belts, he loosened them. Where you counted coins, he shrugged and said, "It'll work out somehow." He lived fast, dreamed big, and rarely seemed to think past next week. Sometimes you admired that freedom in him, but most of the time it left you shaking your head. He knew you had savings. He didn't know the exact number maybe, but he understood it was significant. And in his world, significant sums always looked like solutions. You didn't notice it at first, the way his eyes lingered when conversations touched on weddings, or money, or plans. You just thought he was being supportive, asking questions, showing curiosity about your preparations. Then one evening, sitting together in the living room of your parents' house after a family dinner, he leaned closer. His voice dropped, casual but weighted, like someone sliding a stone across a table. "You've got money saved up, right?" The question startled you more than it should have. He tried to say it offhand, but there was intent there, a direction. You laughed nervously and answered vaguely, hoping the subject would shift. But it didn't. He pressed further, bringing up the idea of dreams, opportunities, tight spots, and the way family was supposed to be there for each other. That night, when you lay in bed, you felt a knot forming in your stomach. It was still only a question, only a possibility, but the knot tightened because you knew how he was. You knew he lived with debts, debts to friends, debts to habits, debts to time itself. And you knew, deep down, that if he ever truly asked you for help, you would find it hard to say no. The wedding fund sat silently in your account, but in that moment it seemed to pulse with new meaning. It was not just your future anymore. It was a temptation, a burden, a glowing light that drew your brother's restless shadow closer. You told yourself it wouldn't come to that. You told yourself that surely he wouldn't cross that line, that surely you would be strong enough to say no if he did. But in families, lines blur, and the heart rarely obeys the strict logic of the mind. As you drifted off to sleep, you wondered, almost against your will, how it would feel if he really did ask. Not for a loan from a bank, not for spare change, but for the very savings you had built to mark the start of your marriage. The thought unsettled you, and yet, in a way you could not yet admit, you already knew the story was beginning. It didn't take long before your uneasy feeling turned into reality. A week after that conversation in your parents' living room, your phone buzzed with a message from your brother. "Can we talk? Just us." He rarely sent messages like that. Short, serious, without emojis or jokes. You felt a chill even before you answered. You agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The kind of place where conversations could sink into the hum of background chatter and coffee machines. He was already there when you arrived, restless, tapping the table with his knuckles. He looked tired, maybe even desperate, though he tried to cover it with a grin. "Thanks for coming," he said, pulling out the chair opposite him. He didn't waste much time on small talk. After 2 minutes of awkward chatter about work and family, his eyes locked on yours. "I need a favor." There it was. The line you had dreaded. He leaned forward, voice dropping low, as though secrecy could soften the blow. "I'm in a tight spot. I owe money. More than I thought I could handle. And, well, I was thinking maybe you could help. Just a loan, just for a little while. You've always been good with money, saving, and all that. I swear, I'll pay you back as soon as I can." You felt your throat tighten. The words hit harder than you expected, even though you had seen them coming. In his tone was a mixture of pleading and confidence, as though he believed that being siblings made your agreement inevitable. You tried to deflect, to stall. "Why me? Couldn't you go to the bank? Or maybe ask for a payment plan?" He sighed and rubbed his face. "The bank won't help me anymore. I've burned that bridge. Friends, well, I've asked them already. You're my only shot. And look, I know you've got money saved. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate." There it was, the direct mention of your savings. He knew. Maybe not the exact number, but enough to know you had what he needed. Your mind screamed 1,000 reasons to say no. This was supposed to be for your wedding. This was money you had worked for, sacrificed for. Handing it over could mean risking everything you had built. But then you looked at him, your younger brother. The boy who used to trail behind you on family trips. The one you had shielded from bullies. The one who once cried when he broke his toy and you gave him yours. That memory twisted like a knife. Blood is thicker than reason, or at least that's how it felt in the moment. "I promise you," he said, leaning closer, his hand gripping the table as though to anchor himself. "I'll pay you back before your wedding. You won't even notice it's gone. I just need this chance to catch my breath." The promise echoed in your head, more like an echo of hope than a certainty. He looked at you with wide, earnest eyes, trying to hold on to your silence, trying to bend it into agreement. You sipped your coffee, but it tasted bitter. No amount of sugar could wash away the dread curling in your stomach. And still, you nodded slowly. Not a yes, not yet, but something close enough that his shoulders sagged with relief. That night, lying awake again, you thought about the way his words had sounded. Half desperate, half rehearsed. You wondered how many others had heard the same tone, the same promises. You wondered if this time would really be different. But the seed had been planted, he had asked. And deep down, you already knew that saying no would feel harder than saying yes. For the next few days, the question gnawed at you. You tried to bury yourself in your routine. Wake up, go to work, scroll through emails, cook dinner, but every quiet moment became an arena for the same battle. On one side stood loyalty, the kind of loyalty that had been drilled into you since childhood. Family, first. Always family. On the other side stood self-preservation. The quiet voice that reminded you this wedding fund was not just money, but years of sacrifice condensed into numbers on a screen. Each time you opened your banking app, the balance stared back at you like an accusation. You imagined handing it over, imagined watching it shrink in a single transaction, imagined explaining to your fiancé why the fund had vanished. The thought made your chest tighten. You played scenarios in your head, like a lawyer rehearsing arguments in front of an invisible jury. If I say no, he'll hate me. He'll say I abandoned him when he needed me most. But if I say yes and he doesn't pay it back, I'll lose not just money, but trust, peace, maybe even the wedding itself. Neither option felt clean. At night, Lying awake beside your fiancé, you debated whether to bring it up. But how do you say, "My brother wants the money we saved for our marriage"? The words tasted like betrayal even before you spoke them. So you kept quiet, holding the secret like a stone in your chest. When you finally did confess, it came out as a sigh over dinner. Your fiancé looked at you with shock, and then with the sharp edge of concern. "You can't give it to him," they said. "This is for us. He's not reliable. You've told me that yourself." You nodded, but the conviction in their voice didn't erase the image of your brother's pleading eyes. Instead, it deepened the divide inside you. If you refused, you would carry your fiancé's approval, but your brother's resentment. If you agreed, you would carry your brother's gratitude, but risk the trust of the person you were about to marry. Either way, a fracture would spread through the foundation of your life. Your parents didn't make it easier. They knew nothing of the specifics, but they spoke in generalities that only sharpened the sting. "Family has to help each other," your mother said one evening when she called just to check in. "We may argue, but when it comes down to it, we're all we've got." You wanted to scream that loyalty had limits, that some debts outweighed the bonds of blood. But you said nothing, and her words lodged themselves in your mind like hooks. The following weekend you met your brother again. You told yourself you'd say no, that you'd explain calmly, that you'd remind him of your own needs. But when he sat across from you, thinner, more anxious, wringing his hands like a man watching sand drain from an hourglass, the words stuck in your throat. He didn't beg this time. He simply said, "I'm out of time." And then he was quiet, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. You looked at him, and the hesitation that had tormented you became something else, an inevitability. It wasn't that you trusted him. It was that you couldn't bring yourself to be the person who refused him. And in that moment, the decision began to tip. The moment you finally said yes didn't feel like a grand decision. It slipped out almost accidentally, like water leaking through a crack in a dam. Your brother had been circling the subject for weeks, and you had been circling it in your head for just as long. When the words left your mouth, "Okay, I'll help you," they sounded quieter than you expected, almost like you were trying to convince yourself more than him. The relief on his face was immediate, a sudden unclenching of tension you hadn't realized he carried in his jaw, in his shoulders, in the restless tapping of his foot under the table. He reached across and grabbed your hand, squeezing hard. "Thank you. You don't know what this means. I swear I'll make it right. Before your wedding, you'll have every cent back." He sounded almost rehearsed, the way a man repeats a vow until he believes it himself. You wanted to believe it too. You wanted to cling to the idea that you weren't gambling your future but simply moving pieces around for a little while. Transferring the money was easier than you thought it would be. A few taps on your phone, a confirmation code, a blink, and suddenly the account that had once been the bedrock of your wedding dream was lighter, significantly lighter. You stared at the screen, waiting for some pang of regret, some wave of nausea. Instead, there was only numbness. Like your body knew you couldn't afford to feel anything yet. Your brother hugged you tightly before leaving, muttering promises into your shoulder. "This will save me. I'll pay you back soon. You won't regret this." His words wrapped around you like a bandage, but the wound underneath still throbbed. For the next few days you carried yourself with an odd mix of pride and dread. Pride, because you had done something generous, something that would make your parents nod approvingly and say, "That's what family is for." Dread, because each time you checked your account, the missing numbers stared back like empty chairs at a table where guests should have been. You didn't tell many people. Your fiancé knew, of course, and they were far less enthusiastic. "It's our money," they reminded you, voice low but sharp. You didn't just give away numbers on a screen, you gave away our future. The words stung, even though they weren't said to hurt. You tried to soothe them, and yourself, with repetition of your brother's vow. "He promised it would be back before the wedding. We still have time. It's temporary." But each time you said it, the words felt a little thinner, a little less solid. Weeks passed. Your brother seemed lighter, freer, as though the money had lifted not just a financial burden, but a cloud that had hung over his entire existence. He laughed more, texted you more casually, and even sent you pictures of small luxuries he was enjoying. Meals out, a new jacket, a weekend trip. Each image chipped at your patience, but you told yourself maybe he needed to breathe before he could repay. In quiet moments, though, you caught yourself staring at your wedding checklist, at the items you had once budgeted for confidently, flowers, catering, photography, and felt a hollow pit in your stomach. Each one was now tied to a promise, a fragile thread that stretched between you and your brother, shimmering but thin. The loan had been made. The trust had been given. And deep down, you already feared what might happen if that thread snapped. At first, you didn't notice the change. Life moved forward, as it always does. You were busy with work, with planning, with small tasks that ate up entire evenings, tasting cakes, comparing flower arrangements, trying to decide between a live band and a DJ. Your brother slipped into the background, and for a while that felt like a relief. He wasn't asking for more, and you weren't chasing him for repayment. But slowly, the absence became obvious. He wasn't checking in anymore. The casual texts that once popped up every few days, jokes, memes, photos, faded into nothing. When you called, he answered less and less, sometimes hours later, sometimes not at all. You told yourself he was just busy. Everyone went through phases like that. But the excuses you whispered to yourself began to sound hollow when they stacked up against the reality. Each unanswered call was like a stone added to a pile, a weight pressing down on your chest. One evening, you scrolled through old messages between you two, watching how the tone had shifted. Before the loan, he had been desperate, then grateful, then full of light. Now, he was distant, evasive. Your last message, "Hey, how are things going?" sat unanswered for days. You stared at it each night before bed, the little gray checkmark mocking your patience. When you finally did get him on the phone, his voice was rushed. Yeah, things are fine. I'll call you later, okay?" But later never came. Meanwhile, the wedding date crept closer. Deposits were due, invoices waiting. You opened your banking app again and again, the missing sum like a hole in the middle of a puzzle you couldn't complete. Your fiancé noticed your tension. "Hey, hasn't paid you back, has he?" they asked quietly. You didn't answer right away. Admitting it out loud felt like peeling off a bandage to reveal an ugly wound. "Not yet," you said finally. "But he will." He promised. The silence that followed between you and your fiancé was heavier than the silence between you and your brother. One was built on doubt, the other on avoidance. Both left you suffocating. Weeks turned into a month. Your brother stopped coming to family dinners. Your mother excused him with talk of stress and work. But you saw the discomfort in her eyes, the way she changed the subject when his name came up. Maybe she knew something. Maybe everyone did. You started to feel like you were the only one pretending this was fine, the only one clinging to the promise that felt less like a vow and more like smoke slipping through your fingers. The silence wasn't just absence anymore. It was a message you didn't want to read. When your brother finally resurfaced, it wasn't with repayment in hand, but with a story. Long, winding, and heavy with apologies. He called you one late evening, his voice full of forced cheer. "Hey, I've been meaning to talk. Things have just been crazy." Crazy, as it turned out, meant everything except responsibility. First, it was his job. He explained how his hours had been cut unexpectedly, how his boss had it out for him, how he was promised a raise that never came. "I was counting on that money," he said, as though his failed expectations could somehow justify yours being on hold. Then, it was his health. A sudden illness, doctor visits, medication costs. He described it in such detail you almost forgot to question it. Until you remembered you hadn't heard about any of this until now. When you tried to press him, his voice shifted. You don't understand how stressed I've been. I'm trying, okay? I just need more time. More time. The phrase became his refrain. Each time you asked, it was on his lips, softening the sharp edge of his broken promise. Next came the blame shifting. You know how expensive things are right now, he said. It's not my fault the economy's a mess. Anyone in my position would struggle. At another point, he hinted that maybe you should have known better than to give him so much. You knew what I was like. Why would you trust me if you couldn't afford to lose it? The words stung like salt in a wound. Somewhere in there was an admission, buried beneath excuses and self-pity. But he never let it linger long enough to be called what it was. A betrayal. You noticed the pattern quickly. Each time you reached out, you'd get a new excuse, a fresh reason why repayment had to be postponed. Sometimes it was believable, sometimes it wasn't, but always, it left you in the same place, waiting. Your fiancé grew less patient by the day. He's stringing you along, they said flatly. He's not planning to pay you back. You wanted to defend your brother, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down you suspected the truth. Yet a part of you still clung to the idea that if you just waited a little longer, if you just gave him one more chance, he might surprise you. Hope is a dangerous thing. It keeps you tethered long after the rope has frayed. And so you listen to the excuses, one after another, telling yourself that this time he really meant it, that this time the promise would stick. But each excuse chipped away at the foundation of your trust, leaving cracks too deep to ignore. By the time the second month had passed without repayment, the cracks in your relationship with your brother had spread outward, touching every corner of your family. It wasn't just between you and him anymore. It had become a silent, invisible weight at dinners, phone calls, and gatherings. When you showed up at your parents' house, you noticed how quickly conversations shifted when your brother's name came up. Your mother busied herself in the kitchen, your father cleared his throat and asked about work, and no one dared to mention the word money. But the silence said it all. They knew something was wrong. Maybe they didn't know the details, but families are like that. Secrets leak through tone and posture long before anyone admits them out loud. Your fiancé stopped hiding their frustration. He's not just ignoring you, he's using you, they said one night. The words sharp but true. And while you're waiting for him, our wedding plans are falling apart. They weren't exaggerating. Vendors were calling, asking about deposits you hadn't been able to pay yet. Invitations you had once dreamed of sending now sat unsent. Each delay made the celebration you had envisioned feel smaller, dimmer. It wasn't just the money. It was the trust. Each time your phone buzzed, you half hoped it would be him finally offering repayment. But more often than not, it wasn't. And when it was, the message carried another excuse, another delay. You felt your patience thinning like thread pulled too tight. At night, you lay awake, turning over in your mind, not just the debt, but the betrayal it represented. This wasn't a stranger or a casual friend. This was your brother, someone you had believed in, someone you had once trusted without question. That trust now felt fragile, cracked like glass after a storm. Family gatherings became tense. You noticed the way your fiancé avoided eye contact with him, the way your parents tried too hard to keep the peace. And you noticed your own bitterness growing, creeping into your voice even when you tried to hide it. One evening, after yet another unanswered call, you sat with your fiancé in silence. The weight between you wasn't just about your brother anymore. It was about what his choices were doing to both of you. You had always believed that family would hold you up in times of need. Now, family felt like the very thing pulling you down. The strain wasn't just financial. It was emotional, relational, spiritual. And though you didn't want to admit it yet, the debt had already cost you something far more valuable than money. It had cost you peace. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening, the kind of night when the clouds seemed to press low against the streets, and every sound carried an edge. You had called your brother 3 times that week, each time ignored. This time, you decided you wouldn't wait for him to come around. You drove to his apartment, heart pounding, rehearsing words you had avoided for too long. When he opened the door, he looked surprised, but not guilty. At least not at first. He smiled thinly, gestured for you to come in, but you stayed rooted in the doorway. "We need to talk," you said, your voice firmer than you expected. The smile faltered. He scratched his neck, stepped aside, and let you in. The apartment smelled faintly of takeout and stale beer. On the counter, a new speaker system sat gleaming, wires still coiled like snakes. The sight tightened your jaw. "I've been patient," you began, trying to steady your breath. "But I can't keep waiting. The wedding is coming. We need that money back." He shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. "I told you, things have been rough. I just need a little more." "No," you cut in, louder than you meant to. "No more excuses, you promised. You looked me in the eye and swore I'd have it before the wedding. That wasn't optional. That was the condition." His eyes flashed, defensiveness rising like a shield. "Do you think I'm not trying? Do you think I don't care? You don't know what I'm dealing with." The argument spilled out in waves. Your demands, his excuses, your anger, his wounded pride. For every accusation you hurled, he hurled one back. You reminded him of the sacrifices you'd made to save that money. He reminded you that you had chosen to give it, that you hadn't been forced. At one point, he slammed his hand against the counter, the sound sharp as thunder. "You act like I'm some stranger who conned you. I'm your brother. Doesn't that mean anything?" "None chance. Asa." The words cut, not because they were true but because they twisted the knife of loyalty you already carried. You wanted to scream that being family should have meant he never asked in the first place. Instead, you stood there, trembling, anger and heartbreak mixing until you couldn't tell which was which. Your fiancé's voice echoed in your head. "He's not planning to pay you back." For the first time, you began to believe it fully. The confrontation ended, not with resolution, but with silence. He turned away, muttering, "I'll figure something out," though his tone carried no conviction. You left his apartment feeling hollow, rain soaking your clothes, as though the sky itself had opened in sympathy. On the drive home, you realized something had shifted. The illusion of patience, of hope, had been broken. The promise was no longer a bond. It was just words, brittle and empty. And though you didn't say it out loud, part of you knew. You might never see that money again. After that stormy night, the relationship between you and your brother entered a new phase, one defined not by avoidance or excuses, but by cold distance. The confrontation had stripped away the thin veil of hope you'd been clinging to. Now there was only the truth, raw and undeniable. He wasn't going to pay you back. At least not anytime soon. Maybe not ever. Family gatherings became battlegrounds of silence. When you entered a room, he found reasons to leave. When he stayed, he sat with his arms folded, eyes fixed anywhere but on you. Your parents noticed, of course, and their worry hung in the air like smoke. They asked questions you didn't want to answer. What happened between you two? Why aren't you talking? You deflected, but the tension was loud enough to speak for itself. Your fiancé grew weary of the entire situation. "It's eating you alive," they said one night, holding your hand across the kitchen table. "Every time his name comes up, I see it in your face. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about respect. And he doesn't have it for you." They were right. The money was still gone, but the real loss was harder to measure. It was the way you no longer trusted your brother's words, the way your chest tightened whenever your phone buzzed with his name, the way your wedding plans had shifted from joy to damage control. You had started to downsize, cutting corners on decorations, reducing the guest list, swapping dreams for practicality. Each compromise was another reminder of what had been taken from you. When you did finally speak to your brother again, it was short, clipped, like strangers forced into conversation. He claimed he was working on it. But you didn't ask for details. You no longer believed in details. All you saw were empty promises and the widening gulf between you. Other relatives began to notice. Whispers circulated. An aunt pulled you aside at a family barbecue and asked softly, "Is everything okay with your brother? He seems different." You forced a smile, but inside you burned with shame. It wasn't just about being betrayed. It was about being seen as someone who had allowed it. The fallout stretched beyond the family, too. Friends who had once admired your bond with your brother now raised eyebrows when you told half-truths to cover the growing rift. You found yourself avoiding the subject altogether, constructing walls of silence to keep the pain hidden. Yet, at night, when the house was quiet, the thoughts returned. You replayed every decision, every hesitation, every moment when you could have said no but didn't. The anger you felt toward your brother sometimes turned inward, festering as guilt. The damage was done. What had once been a close relationship was now fractured, maybe beyond repair. The cost of that loan was more than dollars. It was trust, peace, and the dream of walking into your marriage with family by your side, unbroken. The fallout was here, and you were left to pick up the pieces alone. Long after the wedding was over, smaller than you had hoped, simpler than you had dreamed, you found yourself reflecting on what had happened. The photos showed smiling faces, a celebration filled with love, yet you could see the compromises hidden behind every image. The flowers were fewer, the guest list shorter, the music less extravagant. None of it ruined the day, but each detail carried the faint shadow of what could have been if the fund had remained untouched. Your brother wasn't there. He had made excuses, claimed he was too overwhelmed to show up. Deep down, you suspected the truth. Guilt had kept him away, or maybe just the fear of facing what he had done. Either way, his absence was louder than any speech, louder than the music, louder even than your vows. In the months that followed, you wrestled with the weight of it all. The money never came back, and eventually you stopped asking. The strain had taken its toll, and you no longer had the energy to chase something that clearly wasn't coming. But the experience carved lessons into you, lessons you carried forward like scars. You learned that trust, once broken, rarely returns whole. You learned that love and loyalty are not the same thing, that sometimes love demands distance, and loyalty demands boundaries. You learned that family can fail you, not out of malice but out of weakness, and that weakness can wound as deeply as cruelty. Most of all, you learned the value of saying no. It haunted you, how close you had come to ruining more than just your finances. If you had continued to bend, to enable, to excuse, you might have sacrificed more than money. You might have sacrificed your marriage, your peace, your sense of self. And yet, in the quiet moments you also learned forgiveness, not the kind that excuses or erases, but the kind that lets you live without carrying the weight forever. You forgave him in your heart, not because he asked for it, but because you refused to let his choices define your future. One evening, sitting with your spouse, you said aloud what you had been turning over in your head for months. "We'll never get that money back. But we'll be fine. We built our life without it, and that means it was ours to begin with." The words tasted bittersweet, but freeing. For the first time, the knot in your chest began to loosen. Your brother was still out there, living however he lived, perhaps still chasing shortcuts, perhaps still borrowing promises he could never repay. But you were no longer tethered to that cycle. You who had stepped forward, scarred but stronger. In the end, the story wasn't about money. It was about learning to draw the line, about protecting your dreams even when family tested the edges of your loyalty. And though the wound would never fully disappear, you carried it as a reminder. That love, trust, and family are precious, but only when guarded with wisdom.